There's a moment most men over 40 have witnessed but rarely talk about. A man walks into a room. He's not the youngest man there. He's not the loudest. He may not even be the most conventionally attractive. And yet something shifts. People orient toward him. Women become more attentive in his presence. Conversations deepen when he engages. Nobody can point to exactly why, but everyone in the room feels it. You may have experienced this yourself, not as a fantasy or an inflated self-perception, but as something quiet and observable. A woman holds eye contact a beat longer than expected. A stranger leans in slightly when you speak. There's a quality of attention directed at you that has nothing to do with what you're wearing or how much you earn. It doesn't feel transactional. It feels almost involuntary, on her part as much as yours. This is not a myth. It is not wishful thinking. And it is not something reserved for celebrities or men with extraordinary lives. It happens in ordinary settings, to ordinary men, and the women responding to it often cannot explain what they are responding to. Ask them directly and they'll reach for words that don't quite fit. Calm, grounded, solid, comfortable in himself. These are approximations. They are pointing at something real, but struggling to name it precisely. That struggle to name it is actually important, because what women are detecting in those moments operates below the level of conscious analysis. It bypasses the checklist of conventional attractiveness entirely. It doesn't care much about hairline or waistline. It is reading something deeper, something closer to the nervous system than the eye. The cultural story most men have absorbed says that male attractiveness peaks early and erodes with time, that youth and physical vitality are the primary currencies, that growing older means becoming progressively less relevant in the room. Some men accept this quietly and step back. Others fight it in ways that only confirm it. But that story is not the full picture. And for men who have lived enough life to carry real depth, it may not even be the accurate picture. So if it isn't age and it isn't appearance, the question that matters is a straightforward one. What is it actually? There is a particular kind of steadiness that cannot be performed. It isn't something a man decides to project on a Tuesday morning after watching a video. It isn't a posture or a tone of voice or a carefully constructed persona. It is the residue of having lived through enough difficulty, enough uncertainty, enough loss, that the small provocations of daily life simply no longer move you the way they once did. Not because you've gone numb, but because you've developed genuine proportion. A man in his 20s, regardless of his intelligence or his intentions, is still largely running on urgency. His nervous system is attuned to threat and competition in ways that are biologically appropriate for that stage of life, but which read to perceptive people around him as unresolved. He reacts quickly. He needs to know where he stands. He monitors how he's being perceived almost constantly, even when he's trying not to. This isn't a character flaw. It is simply where he is developmentally. What accumulates in a man over decades, when life has been engaged with honestly rather than avoided, is something neurologically distinct. The capacity to remain emotionally regulated under pressure. The ability to sit with ambiguity without immediately needing to resolve it. A quality of presence that is unhurried because the man carrying it is no longer in a race he feels he needs to win. These are not attitudes a man adopts. They are structures that form through repeated experience, through having been tested and having come through having failed and having rebuilt without collapsing into bitterness. Women, particularly women with their own emotional intelligence and life experience, are extraordinarily sensitive to the difference between a man who is regulated and a man who is merely controlled. Controlled is effortful. You can feel the tension underneath it. Regulated is something else entirely. It has a quality of ease that doesn't require maintenance. It doesn't spike when challenged. It doesn't need the last word. It doesn't require reassurance from the room in order to remain intact. This is what youth cannot manufacture. You can dress a 25-year-old in the aesthetic of maturity. You can give him the vocabulary, but the nervous system tells the truth. And people feel the nervous system long before they consciously register anything else. Here is where the reframe becomes important. Most men have been taught to think of aging as a slow subtraction. Fewer options, diminishing appeal, increasing invisibility. But what is actually happening in a man who is paying attention to his own interior life is accumulation. A quiet compounding of qualities that have no equivalent in younger men because they simply have not had the time to develop them yet. The question is not whether these qualities exist in you. For most men reading this with any degree of self-awareness, they do, at least in part. The harder question is whether they are actually present in how you move through the world, or whether they are sitting underneath a layer of something else. Something that looks like confidence from a distance, but functions very differently up close. That distinction is worth examining carefully. Most men were never taught what confidence actually is. They were shown what it looks like, which is an entirely different thing. They watched it modeled through volume, through decisiveness performed for an audience, through the kind of self-assurance that announces itself the moment a man enters a conversation. And so they learned to reproduce the surface. The firm handshake held a beat too long. The opinion delivered with slightly more certainty than the situation warrants. The humor that keeps people at a careful distance, the composure that never cracks, not because the man is genuinely settled, but because cracking would feel like losing. This version of confidence is extraordinarily common in men over 40, and it is worth naming directly, without judgment, because most men who carry it developed it for entirely legitimate reasons. It was protective, it worked in certain environments, it communicated something useful in professional contexts or in younger years, when the social landscape rewarded that kind of signaling. The problem is not that it was constructed. The problem is that it was never replaced with anything more honest. Performed confidence has a specific texture that people feel before they can name it. It carries a subtle but persistent undercurrent of needing something from the room, needing to be taken seriously, needing the dynamic to confirm what the man already believes about himself. It is approval-seeking, wearing the costume of authority. And women, in particular, detect this almost immediately, not always consciously, but somatically. Something in the interaction feels slightly effortful, slightly transactional. There is a pressure in it, gentle perhaps, but present. And pressure, however well disguised, does not feel like safety. Grounded confidence has an entirely different quality. It is self-referential in the truest sense, meaning it refers back to the man himself, rather than outward to the reactions of others. A man with genuine settled confidence is not monitoring the room for confirmation. He is not adjusting his behavior based on whether people are responding the way he hoped. He can be challenged without stiffening. He can be ignored without shrinking. He can sit in a conversation where he is not the most impressive person present and remain completely at ease because his sense of himself is not contingent on the outcome of any particular interaction. This is not indifference. That distinction matters enormously. Indifference is its own form of performance, a withdrawal from genuine engagement that often reads as arrogance or emotional unavailability. What grounded confidence actually looks like is warm, present, and completely unattached to outcome. The man is fully in the room. He is genuinely interested. He simply does not need the room to give him anything in return. When women describe feeling inexplicably drawn to certain older men, this is the quality at the center of that experience. It is the sensation of being in the presence of someone who has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to protect. There is no agenda running underneath the surface of the interaction, no performance to maintain. And in a world where almost every social interaction carries some degree of subtle negotiation, that absence of agenda is profoundly rare. It registers as calm, as safety, as a kind of quiet authority that has no need to announce itself. The honest question this raises is not whether you understand the distinction. Most men reading this will understand it clearly. The real question is what produces it, because if it isn't a behavior, if it isn't something you do, then it has to be something you are, and that means it begins somewhere much deeper than technique. If grounded confidence is not a behavior, then the question becomes structural. What is actually present inside a man who carries that quality authentically? Not what does he do differently, but what has he built internally that makes the doing unnecessary, because there is an architecture underneath it, a specific arrangement of psychological elements that, when present together, produce something that cannot be counterfeited and does not require maintenance. The first element is clarity of values. Not values in the abstract sense, the kind of words men write on a whiteboard during a corporate workshop, but values as lived operating principles. A man who knows precisely what he will and will not accept in his own behavior, regardless of circumstance or convenience, carries a particular kind of internal coherence. He doesn't need to deliberate at length over decisions that touch his character, because those decisions were already made long before the situation arose. This coherence is felt by people around him as consistency, and consistency in a world of shifting presentations and contextual personalities is quietly magnetic. The second element is the absence of active resentment. This one requires honesty, because resentment is perhaps the most common invisible weight carried by men in midlife. Resentment toward women shaped by difficult relationships, resentment toward a culture that seemed to change the rules midway through the game, resentment toward younger men, toward time itself, toward opportunities that closed before they were fully explored. These resentments are understandable. Many of them are even justified in origin, but a man who is still carrying them actively, even if he never expresses them directly, broadcasts them in ways he is rarely aware of. They surface in a slightly hardened quality of humor, in a tendency to interpret neutral situations through a negative lens, in a guardedness that presents as strength but functions as a wall. Women with any emotional intelligence read this accurately and respond to it with a distance that often confuses the man entirely. The third element is comfort with silence. Not the silence of withdrawal or sullenness, but the silence of a man who does not need to fill space in order to feel secure within it. A man who can sit across from someone, fully present, without the low-grade anxiety that generates nervous talking, unsolicited opinions, or the compulsive need to be interesting. This kind of silence is an act of confidence so quiet that most people never consciously identify it. But they feel the difference between a man who is comfortable in stillness and one who is secretly afraid of it. The fourth element is non-transactional warmth, genuine interest in other people that carries no hidden invoice. A man who listens because he is actually curious, not because listening is a strategy. Who offers warmth without keeping score, without expecting it to be returned in a specific currency. This quality is rarer than it sounds, particularly in men who have been hurt or disappointed enough times to develop an unconscious accounting system around their emotional generosity. Together, these elements form something that functions less like a personality and more like a foundation. And the critical point is this: a man cannot decide to have these qualities for the purpose of being more attractive. The moment they become instrumental, deployed in service of an outcome, they collapse into performance. They are only real when they exist for their own sake, as expressions of who a man has chosen to become over the course of his life. Which brings the entire conversation down to something practical and immediate. Because identity, however solid internally, only matters insofar as it shapes how a man actually moves through the world each day. Nothing about this is dramatic. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand before closing. There is no moment of transformation, no single conversation that confirms you have arrived somewhere new. What actually shifts when a man has done the internal work honestly is far more subtle than that, and far more durable. It begins with the quality of attention you receive without seeking it. Conversations develop more depth more quickly. People, not only women but people in general, speak to you with a different register of candor. They sense accurately that you are not going to react badly to honesty, that you are not fragile underneath the surface, that they do not need to manage you, and so they don't. What you get in return is something most men are quietly starving for without fully realizing it. Genuine contact, interactions that feel real rather than performed. Women specifically respond to this with a quality of ease that expresses itself in small, consistent ways. Not in grand gestures or obvious signals, but in the texture of ordinary moments, the way a conversation lingers past its natural ending, the way your presence is requested rather than tolerated. These are not trophies. They are simply the natural response of people encountering someone who is genuinely at home in himself. The temptation at this point is to look for external confirmation that something has changed, to measure progress by how others respond. But that temptation is itself the thing worth releasing, because a man who has genuinely built this internal architecture does not need the room to confirm it. The evidence he trusts is internal, his own increasing clarity, his own decreasing reactivity, the quiet satisfaction of acting in alignment with what he actually values. Attraction, in the end, is not the real subject of this conversation. It never was. The real subject is integrity of self. And the quiet truth is this: when a man gets that right, everything else, including how women feel in his presence, tends to follow without being chased.